Well, America's student debtors need clarity, not an endless payment pause. That's according to former FDIC Chair Sheila Bair. She writes that in a new op-ed for Yahoo Finance, and she's joining us now. We should also note, by the way, when it comes to students, she has some experience. She was the former president of Washington College and also author of the Money Tale series, which teaches money basics to young people. Sheila, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. So the payment pause, which certainly came as a relief to many student debtors in the early days of the pandemic, why do you think it's time to end it?
Yeah, so this is the 2-year anniversary this month, and I strongly supported it when they originally did it and extended it as the damage from the pandemic continued. But it's really time, I think, to provide some certainty for student borrowers. And there have been 5 extensions, and they need some certainty. They need some time to prepare. It's been a long time since they've made these payments. They may need to adjust their budgets, cut back on other debt or expenses to be able to get ready to start repaying again. And so there needs to be some certainty, clarity, and it needs to give them a sufficient, preparation time so they can start making payments on these loans. And the other issue, which I think the administration's acknowledged, which I welcome and support, which I mentioned, is what is the administration going to do with debt forgiveness or debt cancellations? Because if you're sitting there, with $20,000 of debt, but there's a good chance the president might, through executive action, cancel some part or all of it. Why do you want to start going ahead and making payments now when later on it could be canceled and you will have cost yourself some extra money? So I do think they need to provide clarity. What are they going to do on forgiveness, cancellation before this repayment starts again? But they need to make decisions on both and move on with it.
Sheila, how helpful would it be financially to households if $10,000 in student debt is forgiven?
Yeah, well, it would wipe out the debt for about a quarter of student borrowers and have it for another quarter. So it's about half of student borrowers who would be very significantly benefited through a $10,000 debt forgiveness. I think that's the most defensible and justified of all the different options that have been discussed. The benefits are primarily for lower income borrowers of color, students already in financial distress. They're in default. About half of borrowers who are in default owe less than $10,000. So there's clear progressive benefits targeted to the people who need it the most. You get into larger amounts, and there are sympathetic cases, and people I respect are advocating much higher levels of debt forgiveness. But you do get in and start benefiting more and more professional school students, graduate school students, typically upper income households that can't afford it and can't afford to repay. And I do think it's important to remember that there's the standard option is a 10-year repayment plan for your student loan. But if people have trouble making that, there are alternative, what they're called income-driven repayment plans that are based on an affordable percentage of your income, not just the standard 10-year plan. And the administration, another thing I really applaud, the administration is working very hard to simplify those IDRs, income-driven repayment plans, consolidate them into one simple option and make, enrollment virtually automatic if the student borrower wants to opt for that. So there are other areas of relief for those who owe more than $10,000. But I do think forgiving $10,000 for everybody would again wipe out or significantly reduce payments for about half of student borrowers, and that's huge. That's not insignificant. And but I think the rest, if you can afford to repay, you should start repaying. Student borrowers most of them got meaningful degrees that helped their income producing potential. There was a contract that they agreed to. There are a lot of flaws in the student debt program. I've been talking about that for years, but nonetheless, most students have gotten degrees that have benefited from them. If they have some capacity to repay, they should. And there are different options that the government will provide to make sure that they're.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, a lot of people are still underwater on a lot of their debts, unfortunately. Sheila, there's always a gap between what government should do and what it will do. And so I'm wondering is there any, bipartisan movement on this issue that makes the prospects of it actually getting done some level of forgiveness?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, there has been some Republican support for some level of debt forgiveness. I think there's an argument the executive branch has the ability to just do this through executive authority, so they wouldn't really need bipartisan support. I think if you keep it to $10,000 or below, you're probably going to have a stronger case to be able to do it, just through executive action versus going through Congress. But on the other hand, what I worry about is we're just going to keep extending this pause forever. Politicians cite these polls and say, well, there's all this big support for student debt forgiveness or indefinite pauses. And well, of course there is. Nobody wants to repay their loans. But I do think that most borrowers, they have the capacity to repay, are willing to repay. And again, there are different repayment options to make sure their payment's affordable. But we're sending young people especially, all the wrong signals about what debt is. I mean, it's first of all, it's too easy to get a student loan to begin with. You've got, it's just this euphemistically called financial aid. Younger people are not encouraged to think through, understand this is a debt, it's a legal obligation that's going to have to be repaid later on. It's kind of marketed as financial aid. It's like nobody kind of de-emphasizes the fact that you got to repay it later. No emphasis on affordability. And then we have this endless pause and confusion about, will we ever have to pay it back? And that just sends all the wrong signals about personal responsibility, the seriousness of debt, including student debt, in terms of being a claim on your financial future is a serious business. It should not be undertaken lightly. And then your obligation should be fulfilled as well. So I do think this whole thing has been handled in a way that sends young people all the wrong messages about what debt is, how serious it is, and that there's an obligation to pay it back.
And just quickly then, I mean, debt is also a useful tool as you go throughout your life.
It absolutely is.
So what is the risk here, the biggest risk in your mind with the student debt system as it stands?
Right. Well, I think, look, if you do widespread, so I think $10,000 is very defensible. If you start getting higher than that without doing more fundamental reforms, you're really just going to be encouraging more profligacy in the student borrowing because, and I've seen it. I've heard colleges do it. Shame on them. They shouldn't, but some do that. Go ahead and borrow, pay for this expensive graduate degree. They're going to, forgive it later. And this is going to send all the wrong signals. So it actually could encourage student borrowers to even be more cavalier about the kind of obligations they're taking on and letting colleges exploit that. I mean, the student loan proceeds, let's face it, those go to higher education institutions. They're the ones that benefit directly financially from it. And they have no incentives under the current program to take any personal accountability. The financial incentives are not such that to make sure that student actually gets a degree that's going to enhance their income producing potential. So I do think either this goes on forever, and I think this is unfair to students too. They need certainty. They need to be ability to plan. It's still hanging over their head. But if you go through whole scale, really widespread debt forgiveness without reforming the system so that students are better equipped to understand that the debt is an obligation they'll need to repay, that higher education institutions have some accountability to make sure they don't overborrow and they're getting a degree that's worthwhile. You don't have those reforms too. We could just double down on what is already a very problematic system. So I guess that is my biggest worry. And I do have compassion for these student borrowers who are going to have to start repaying again after 2 years. That's going to be hard for them. And I want, if it takes another extension to make sure they have time to prepare, then so be it. But again, help them understand debt is a serious obligation. Taxpayers deserve to be repaid. And there are different options, repayment options that they can utilize if they have trouble repaying. I have long advocated actually an equity model, income share, where you just get away from debt completely. That's unfortunately not gotten traction, but at least if we're dealing with the current framework, there's some improvements we can make to make it a lot better.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that at least some of them get done in the next couple of years. Yeah. Sheila Bair, great to catch up with you. Former chair of the FDIC. You can read Sheila's op-ed on yahoofinance.com. She's also the former president of Washington College. Fun fact, I went to some summer camp at Washington College as a Maryland resident, and it was lovely. It's a lovely campus.
It is
Thanks
beautiful.
so much, Sheila. Appreciate it. Take care and have a great weekend.